With the new influx of players caused by the upcoming game Elden Ring, Dark Souls 3's player base has nearly tripled in size from its traditional levels. With that in mind, I felt it was high time to create a tier list for all the weapons. With all the new people playing in over 170 weapons, it's hard to pick which ones to use and which ones to just ignore. With that in mind, I wanted to make an untraditional tier list, ones where whether you should or should not use a weapon was put more to the forefront as to whether how good the weapon is. With that, let's look at the tiers. Starting from the bottom up is trash tier, weapons that you just really shouldn't use. They're hard to hit people with and or hard to make builds for. The next up is utility weapons. These are weapons who their best use case is as either a swap or an offhand that you don't use at all. This is for swapping for wake-ups, to chase people down as finishers, or just to counter certain setups. The next category is the memes category, and these are weapons that, while aren't that great, have some potential to them to beat people, and in doing so, you can really clown on people. Like, there's weapons that are known to be bad, but aren't as bad as everyone thinks. The next class is the outclassed class. These are weapons that, honestly, all the weapons in this category have a counterpart in the same class of weapons that are longer, that do more damage, that have better movesets, and in doing so, renders these weapons completely useless, because why would you use just a worse version of another weapon? The next category is as a paired setup. And now what I mean here is the weapons on their own are not necessarily the best, but when paired with other weapons, do extremely well. These are the paired setups of the game, because you can hold a weapon in each hand, and some weapons do very well when you do so. The next class up is the with a co-main. These are weapons that you can almost solo main, but they have certain matchups that require them to have something to swap to. This is often quick step daggers, which counter a lot of long-range weapons, and daggers in general. Also shields will hard counter many pure physical weapons, requiring them to swap off. That is why they're in the co-main section. The last section is solo viable, and solo viable weapons are what they say. These are weapons that, in pretty much every matchup in the game, you can use without swapping off of. They may not have all positive matchups, but pretty much do. With that out of the way, let's get into the list. The first class of weapons that we're going to look at is a great axe. Now, standalone, most of them aren't all that good, but most in this class really can be paired with either a straight sword, a rapier, a hammer, something like that, and do very well in the paired setup. The outlier here is the Black Knight Greatsword, which honestly its only utility is in either using it as a one-handed or as a one-shot swap for riposte. The Earthquaker is just, it takes too weird of a build to make it work. It requires a strength faith build, but to one-hand it requires too much strength for it to fit on a generally efficient build in that sense. Demon's Great Axe is also decent, should go up in the paired setups. And Great Axe, honestly, it's outclassed by all the other Great Axes. It's shorter and does similar damage. So generally, you wouldn't want to use it. You'd choose something like a Yorms over it, or just swapping the bows around, though it is decent on a dark build. Next class is Daggers. Handsman's Dagger, I'm going to put it in memes, because while it is a terrible weapon compared to all the other daggers, it's still a dagger. It still has the Corvian moveset, and it can still just run people over. But in general, there's no real reason to use it other than just to clown on people, honestly. This has utility because it boosts damage. Solo viable, and honestly a lot of the daggers are solo viable. The parrying dagger is, again, meme weapon. It's a dagger, so it's gonna do well, but it's also really just a mid dagger. And to clown on people with it, yeah, it's just a meme weapon. But things like Murky, Harp, Rotten Grew dagger are all solo viable along with Corvian. I think Aquamarine is, and I actually think Breaker is. No one really mains it anymore, and it's really become an offhand when Corvian's banned. But yeah, I think you can still solo main it. Tailbone Short Sword, again, meme weapon. you can still very easily kill people with. These aren't bad weapons, these three, but they're there to clown on people. They're just bad. The dagger, utility for its ripostes, and again, not good. Utility for its bleed damage, actually. So if you bleed infuse this, and it's decent against shields when you do that, because you can just spam on shields. And actually, I've seen people also poison infuse it so that you can have both bleed and poison on shields, though you have to have someone who is dedicated to turtling in order to do that. The next class of weapons we're going to go over is the Ultra Greatswords. First off, with the Astoras, it is an awesome paired weapon. I usually use it with the S-Stock, and it is just one of the best pseudo-combo weapons in the game. Like, all honesty, just S-Stock into R2, S-Stock into R1, running attack into S-Stock. All pseudos, but really, really powerful pseudos. And then this is mid, and most of the other ultras are worth using on their own, but you need to swap on certain matchups. And it is just the thing with ultras. They have some decent matchups in the game, but they also have matchups that are absolutely losing. Like, it would never win against a quick-step weapon. It would never win against a turtle. But some other setups it would win against. So they're worth using, but you need to have an offhand for those setups that you cannot beat with it. The only exceptions are the Cathedral and Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword. They don't have the rolling poke, and so they just don't have the mix-ups, really, to make it possible. Though I'm going to move Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword just up to good as a paired setup because it is super, super long. And it can actually do decently well with, say, Offhand Dagger, where its roll catch is really powerful. The next class of weapons we're going to look at is Straight Swords. Aerithil, honestly, it's outclassed by all the other ones, but it's still... Aerithil is solo viable. If not for all the other Straight Swords. Like, Lothric goes up in solo viable. I even think Valahart is a solo viable weapon. With and without the glitch moveset cancel. The Ring Knight is solo viable. So is Darksword, Goddards, everyone knows Goddards. And that's about it for the solo viable Straight Swords. The Broken Straight Sword goes in memes, just because you can still win with it. It's not the worst. And if you really want to clown on someone, just pull out the Broken Straight Sword. That's what I've had the experience with throughout. If someone really wants to clown on someone, you just pull out the Broken Straight Sword and win. That, trash. Morning's Blade has a utility of the Red Tier Stone Ring, though it's also... You can probably just use it as a weapon, though it would get outclassed by all the other straight swords. The next 7 here just get outclassed. Astoras, Henri's, Sunlight, Short Sword, Broadsword, Longsword, and Barbed Straight Sword. All get outclassed by the other straight swords in the class. And then Lothric's Holy Sword has some utility. That's the only other straight sword that I'll admit has utility. And it's just to be really annoying as a finisher. Its light beam is hard to react to and just is a decent finisher, though there are better finishers in my opinion. The next class we're going to move on to is the Greatswords. The Bastard Sword, we're going to start out with, just gets outclassed by the other swords. It is shorter and has a worse R2 in weapon art. The next sword, again, outclassed. The Executioner's Greatsword is just worse. Again, falls into the class of having a bad R2, less damage, and less range than all the other Greatswords. This, again, I'm going to put it in here because it has a beam as a finisher, and isn't the worst idea to swap to on a dark build when you have a Claymore and need a finisher. Otherwise, it doesn't have much use. While the R2 of the Flamberge is interesting, that's about it. It loses out damage-wise, and if you can't land that R2, it doesn't have the R2s to really back it up, so I'd put it again in just the outclassed range. Same for this one. Though you can put it on a blessed build, you can put it on a buff build, and make it do tons and tons of damage. It is just way too short to really be a good weapon. Again, this is a weird build weapon. It's a weapon that you get from Pontiff, and it's a magic weapon, and it does really good damage. But again, It doesn't have the R2, it doesn't have the range, and it really doesn't have the weapon art. Claymore is the first one that I would put up in co-main. I don't think Greatswords can be solo viable. They lose to too many setups. They have weird matchups against Ultras. They have losing matchups against Spears, Daggers. I mean, even arguably straight swords and curved swords. They have just unfavorable matchups. And in some of the circumstances, you're going to win. And if you really want to, you can. But I generally think that a lot of the good Greatswords just need to have a secondary with them. They just need it. This is a meme weapon. The Firelink Greatsword just framed the weapon art, and that's really all it has going for it. The Moonlight Greatsword, unfortunately, it just doesn't do the damage. It does have the range, but it doesn't have the R2, and it doesn't have the damage of all the other Greatswords. So I just have to keep it an outclassed. Lowest Knight, longest, pure damage, and it has decent weapon arts. Like his weapon art R1 can really catch people off guard. Onyx Blade also goes up here because of its range and its good R2 and self buff. Though I wish the self buff actually did the same damage as the sword. I forget which way it goes around, but the sword has fire damage, I think. But the sword has dark damage, and then the buff is fire damage. So it goes three-way split and does not nearly as much damage as it actually shows in the AR. The giant rapier, those who remember that. But yeah, the Hollow Slayer is decent and can definitely be used as a standalone greatsword, along with Gales. Gales is probably the best of the pure physicals greatswords. Claymore might be better just because it can be put on a dark build and can get higher damage on physical builds, but that I don't use greatswords enough to really discern between the two. This is a meme weapon. Hitting people with a weapon art is really, really funny. No one should get hit by the weapon art, but they do. And so it gets straight into the meme category. The Black Knight Greatsword has utility. If you are a Greatsword user on a quality build, and you have trouble fighting Ultras, just use this. An Ultra really doesn't have much to do to fight this, and it's just a bad matchup and all around. So, I mean, it has that sort of utility, it has the perseverance, and that's why it's good. Wonders is a weird sword, because it is one of the longer Greatswords, but also it's just on a weird build. Like, you can make it do damage, but it takes a strength faith build, like a 2760 or something like that, and it does around 500 AR, but again, it lacks R2, but I have to put it co-manable because it just it has the range, it has the damage, it's just on a weird build and no one uses it because of that. The next category we're going to look at is spears and pikes. Our store spear, it's just too short. Wing spear, partisan. Honestly, you can co-main partisan. Partisan is a very good spear, and most of the spears are going to go in the co-main category just because they lose to quickstep, and they also, in the pure physical versions of them, lose to shields. They are almost solo viable, and if it weren't for those weird matchups, they would be. But they get such hard countered by them that you need an offhand. You need something to swap to when you're fighting daggers, and that's just the long and short of it. Like, Plow goes there, they made this bad on purpose, and then it's like outclassed. Yorshka's is a meme weapon. Yorshka's is a meme weapon because everyone thinks it's bad. It gets outclassed by other things and really should go in the outclass, but because everyone thinks it's bad, they don't realize it has the partisan moveset, the good R2, and still okay-ish range. So you can really clown on people with it. Again, Biden is one of the top spears, probably the best damaging one with the 2760 build. Strength infused and then buffed. And then you can swap off to something that has like 530 AR, lightning infused. So it's one of the really, really good buffed weapons. Unfortunately, Dragonsire just doesn't have the damage to compete with the other spears, though I wish it did because I love its R2. Like, it's one of the few spears that has the good running attack and the good R2 on it. I don't even remember the name of this, but I remember it's weird, it doesn't have any range, and it doesn't do any damage with the sorceries that it does cast. Followers Javelin is a meme weapon. You just chuck them across the arena, And if they hit, but rarely do they, and they can't be free aimed with enough accuracy to actually ever hit people. Pike, again, outclassed. I think you can still use Gargoyle Flame Spear. They nerfed this range, and his damage is still not great, but you can probably still use it because it's still, even after its nerf, one of the longer spears in the game. Tailbone Spear, I should say. Again, free aim it. It actually has a lot of utility, I'd say. Though it is a bit of a joke, especially in like invasion situations or if someone's running away, you can actually do some decent chase down with this. Knock people off ledges and whatnot. The Gru Spear isn't bad. It's just worse than all the other spears. It's just a little bit shorter, does a little bit less range. That's the only reason it goes there. The paired spears, decent. A lot of people recently have been using them, and honestly, I underestimated them for a while, but I've seen some people use them very well, so I'll have to put them in co-manable. The Lothric War Banner itself, honestly, I'm going to put it in with as a paired setup, because my favorite setup was paired with Halberd. Again, these two pair very, very well together. And along with offhand straight sword and whatnot, just as a damage buff for your offhand weapon, and as a decent running attack to boot. Again, I'm going to rate the other poke halberd. Same, awesome paired setups. Doesn't really shine out on its own, and that's why it goes in that category. Lothric Knight Longspear is going to go into utility because of its poise buff, though it is definitely not just only a utility weapon. It can be used on its own, though it doesn't have the good running attack. This is going to be a controversial one. The Ring Knight Spear gets outclassed. It just doesn't have the damage. It has the good weapon art, it has the good art too. Now, I'm going to have to put it in co-manable. Well, I believe the Ring Knight Spear is just not as good as all the other spears here. You can't deny it has the range. It lacks a bit in damage, but it has a good moveset. And this weapon art isn't the worst in the world, though it is very much so parry bait. It is very much so backstab bait. Next, Great Lance. Now, I'm going to put Great Lance in the meme category because you can use Great Lance. But Great Lance is just bad. And the point of using it is just to say, I beat someone with Great Lance, the weapon that everyone knows is bad. So I'm just going to leave it here. Though you can definitely use it in a paired setup. You can even like co-man it, but there's just not really the point, and it's just not quite good enough. Next thing, this halberd. You can probably do this with a co-man. Dragon Slayer's halberd, Sword Spear, I should say. It just lacks a bit of damage, but it is the longest halberd, I do believe. And its damage isn't that bad, and it trades it off for a good running attack. So, I wouldn't say that it gets outclassed, but it's on like the bottom end with a co-man. Gundyrs, on the other hand, is an awesome utility weapon. If you haven't ran into it yet, Gundyr swap after a backstab or a parry riposte is really hard to get out of. And just Gundyr swap from neutral when someone's chasing you down, it's nasty. It'll hit tons and tons of times when it really looks like it shouldn't. The only halberd that I'm going to put in solo viable is Splitleaf. And that's because of its damage and its moveset. Like its weapon art, you can just sit there, poise through anything that comes your way and clip them for like a full combo if they even attempt to hit you. So I'm going to put it here. It's super lame, it's super passive, but honestly, it is an S tier solo viable weapon. Crucifix of the Mad King. Again, it doesn't quite have a good enough moveset to get it out of co-manable, but it hits like a truck. Its weapon art R1, or its R1 weapon art, both combo, or even weapon art, just melts people if you have a buff on it. And that's why it's going in co-manable. Wing Knight Halberd, again, it doesn't have a good weapon art. Like all the other halberds. Halberds in this game are pretty much made by the weapon art that they have. And this just doesn't have a good one. So it just gets outclassed. Immolation Tinder, on the other hand, is an interesting case. On paper, it's OP. But in practice, it is really hard to catch panic rolls after casting. Like, even with the Homing Soul Mass, I found that it just doesn't synergize with the weapon well enough to bring it up into solo viable. If it did, it would be solo viable, but it just doesn't. But that doesn't really take away from it being a good weapon. Again, Glaive with a co-main, like, it's one of the worst of the Halberds, but it is dark and feasible, and it has one of the better weapon arts, though I have heard that the R1 weapon art R1 doesn't land as often with this. If that's true, maybe avoid it. Black Knight Glaive, on the other hand, same weapon art, connects more frequently, and has a better R2. The only downside, though, is it will lose to shields, just because it's a pure physical weapon. You can't dark infuse it. But otherwise, it does decently in most matchups. And, well, quick step daggers, but pretty much everything loses to those anyway, so it doesn't really much matter. Again, with Lucerne. Lucerne has the good weapon art, it has the combo, and it also, on top of all of that, has shield chip, and it has Leer Ring damage. It has poke damage for Leer Ring. So that all together makes it really, really hit hard. But if you can't get your Leer Ring pokes out, it hits a bit below average, so that is one of the weaknesses of this weapon. This was put in here as a mean weapon, but it honestly doesn't even have as much going for it, so I'm just going to put it in trash. Axes are a bit of a boring category. The ones that have range and do damage can be used in paired setups. Wing Knight Twin Axes, yeah, you can use them on their own, but I don't think they have the range, but they've definitely got the damage. Hand Axe, again, awesome in paired setups. On its own, it's okay. Thrall Axe, it's usable. It's a bit short, but it has quick step, and you can be quite annoying with it. So it has its uses, but honestly, I wouldn't use it over Hand Axe if you want that moveset. Millwood Axe, great chase down ability with its weapon art, and not much else going for it. It's a little bit shorter, but has the highest damage of all the axes. Well, ignoring Dragon Slayers, which I'm going to put Dragon Slayers as a paired weapon, because if you use it with like the Hand Axe Axe combo, Dragon Slayer's Axe can hit for like 700 AR. Well, it will have 700 AR in certain setups, so it's definitely something worth using in a paired setup. But on its own, axes don't have a diverse enough moveset. And here we come to the bottom end of the axes. And they just, they're shorter and have less damage, and so they don't really have the utility of the other axes. And we're on to Katanas now, and the Katanas really have the same issue, where we've got a couple of ones that you can use as a co-main, like Onakiri and Frayed Blade. Honestly, you can use those solo. Well, solo and with a swap off, I should say. But all the other Katanas, they're just decent in paired setups. You just use them main hand, use them for the running attack, and nothing else. Even the bad Katanas can be used this way. The one standout, though, I would say, is Blackblade, which has a decent R2 along with its running attack. But beyond that, I don't see too much other use for them. Now, some people do two-hand Katanas and use the weapon art, but I'd say they do have a better use case in a paired setup. The next category we're going to look at is the hammers. We're going to start with Morningstar, which just gets outclassed. Less range, less damage than all the other regular hammer movesets. This would have been a very, very good weapon if they had not taken out the poise. This weapon, if you did not know, used to have poise on its attacks. And during that time, I do not believe that Lightning Arrow had come out. But this weapon just got nerfed and rebuffed and nerfed a bunch of times. And it ends up that it is now unparryable, but does not have poise. Now, if it had poise and was parryable, it might even grace solo viable. With Lightning Arrow and But to put that in a context, we have to really talk about Bonk, which not many people have used up until recently. Now, Bonk, you have to co-main it with something because it has some terrible matchups. Like, it loses terribly to Greatswords, it loses terribly to Daggers. But it can win some other really interesting set matchups. Like, it wins against Halberds because you can go through Halberds. It does okay against Spears, which is weird. It goes okay against ultras because it breaks their roll plays, and it even goes great against straight swords, even turtle builds, because it does really high shield chip damage. But its terrible matchups keep it down here. Now, what I was talking about with the Rose of Ariandel was this is longer, has a wider hitbox, and has more utility. The only downside, it would have less damage, but since it doesn't have the poison anymore, it doesn't have the real pressure that it can put down. The mace does very well in paired subs, as well as the war pick. Pick and poke is awesome if you haven't used it. It's war pick and offhand S-Stock. You can also do a similar build with offhand hand axe and mace on a strength build, and that does decently well. You can also use war pick there, though I prefer mace because it does a bit more damage. The maracas are a meme weapon. You can never hit people with it. Though I've heard rumors of it having a infinite, though what I've heard how to get the infinite, you have to hit a clean attack, which you're not going to. You're just not. The hazel pick definitely can be used as a co-main, with a co-main, though it doesn't have the best weapons to swap off to. Like, you can swap off to maybe Aquamarine or something else. It has such damaging combos, though another downside I do remember is it is hard to min-max for. You need poise, you need magic, you need like 60 int to do good damage with it. It's a hard weapon to min-max with, though if you can pull it off, it does do decently well, and you can co-main it. This, just outclassed, and we're on to the curved ultras. The only really bad curved ultra is the bleed one. It just gets outclassed by all the others. The rest I would put in paired setups. Like, they're decent, but honestly, their curved ultras are really hard to use just on their own. They have no real fast outspacing options, and don't have any way to set up into panic rolls either. So you just sort of have to running attack at people and just wait for them to die. And I mean, there's some other tricks you can do with them, but in general, I would not rate them very highly. But as a paired setup, they're very, very good. Offhand hand axe is a very well-known combo for invasions and for duels. Offhand S-Stock, offhand dagger, main hand straight sword, offhand curved ultra is an awesome setup. And Wolf Knight is the only one that I would not necessarily put in this category because it just doesn't have the one-handed range. You can technically use it two-handed because it does have the tools of the weapon art. The weapon art makes this weapon, and it does decent combos, and one-handed it doesn't gain from any of that. And it has lower damage, so it relies on these combos, but the combos really make the weapon, and you can technically co-main it, but it's honestly, it's on the line, because it is, such a hard weapon to use. Next category we're talking about is curved swords. Carthus, if you didn't know, got nerfed several times over, but I can't even put it in an outclass anymore because it's decent as a main hand weapon one-handing it. Like, a lot of the old curved swords that were nerfed, like Faller Saber, Carthus, whatnot, they cannot be used two-handed, but they can absolutely be used one-handed, and then with great utility. Like, one-handed curved sword with an offhand ultra curved sword is an awesome combo, and we've seen that a lot in on other platforms. And that with ultras, that with great axes, are all really, really good combos. Now, some of the bad curved swords are the bleed curved swords, which just get outclassed by cell swords. Dancer swords, I'll have to put them in the meme category, actually, because they're really bad, but they have a unique enough weapon art and a moveset that you can use them to clown on people, but they don't have any real bite to them. Like, they can hit hard, but good luck hitting with them. Shuttle, again, outclassed. Short, the shield chip isn't really worth it because we have infused weapons in this game. Now on to the good curved swords. Demon Scar, you can solo main that. Rotten curved sword, you can solo main. PK, you can solo main. Scimitar, again. Painted is weird. Painted Guardian curved sword, because it's still one of the fast curved swords. Like, I would put it in outclassed, because it is outclassed. But again, you can main Painted Guardian Curvesword. It is short. It doesn't do amazing damage, but it is still the fast Curvesword moveset. And as proven, you can still win tournaments with it. Meme weapon. You can shoot the beam at people. Other than that, it's not even a meme weapon. It just gets outclassed. It's way too short, the Moon Curvesword. And then Storm Curvesword it's a weird one. I'm going to put it in outclassed, but you might be able to solo main this. It got hit by the nerfs, but it's still around the length of a scimitar, and it has a decent weapon art, so it's not worthless to use, per se. But it is definitely worse than all the other good Curveswords. Sellswords is the last Curvesword that I'm going to put in solo viable. It's on the edge here. They have a lot going for them when it comes to frame data. Like, it will get priorities over a lot of different things that you would not expect them to get priority over. So if you get hit by a sellsword, you're going to have to roll. Like, pretty much. Or you're going to tank tons and tons of damage, because weapon art gets priority over a lot of things. The kick gets priority over pretty much everything. I've seen people kick out of R1 armor rolling combos. Like, third R1 doesn't come out fast enough. So it's a bit ridiculous, but again, that's why it's in solo viable. The size, you can use them, like, most of them are, these two are outclassed. But the Corvian Scythe, you can definitely use with a swap. You can use it both with swap and actually with a pair. And I'm gonna actually put it best in a paired setup. We've seen a lot of people use it with offhand straight sword, offhand dagger, offhand thrusting sword. And honestly, the R2 actually has a bunch of utility to it, along with the great running attack and decently long R1s. So it's an interesting weapon to use in a paired setup, and does really well there. But also keep in mind that you can just use it two-handed on its own, and it has one of the longest attacks in the game, though it suffers much from its narrow hitbox, where people can strafe around you, backstab, pressure you, stuff like that. So it almost has to be free aim, but if you free aim it well enough, it does decent. I'm going to put freeze in utility, though I struggle to put it there because no build really has it as an easy swap. Like, technically you can swap to it on a dark build, and that's probably the best build that you can swap to it on. No one's running a Dex int build with the amount of faith required for this weapon, and that's the problem. It has an awkward stat requirement of 11 faith, and with that, it's just no build gets to use a swap, but it's an awesome swap, so it's going to go here nonetheless. The claws are all... they get outclassed by their weapons. The Crow Talons are the closest to being a good weapon, but in all honesty, they have the bad running attack. They have the bad two-handed running attack. And if they had the good one, these would actually be decent, because they do good damage, they have good range, but they don't have the good running attack, so you just get outclassed by all the other weapons in the game. Cestus itself has tons of utility, both with Perseverance, as a parry tool, and just as a light offhand to infuse, so it's got to go there. Demon Fists are honestly the only paired fist weapon that you can just use. That's because of its weapon art. It's just, instant poise button, I should say, where you just have a ton of forward momentum and just clip people into it. It has a ton of damage on its running attack. It's R1, and just the threat of instant poise trades makes it a decent weapon. It's still really hard to use, but it is usable, so it goes in co-mainable. I'm going to say Lido's is the only Great Hammer that's usable. The rest are just way too slow. I mean, Stonehammer, technically you can swap to it. Technically you can swap to this, but no one has the stats for it, so it doesn't matter anyways. Just, they're way too slow. None of them have good R2s. The Great Club's R2 is way blown out of proportion. Like, it's easy to outspace, it's easy to roll through. Again, I've had it pointed out this way. It is a very slow wind-up, but also is a slow release, so you have the time to reaction roll it. What makes a lot of other ultras decent with their R2s is they have a slow wind-up, but a fast release, so you can almost do it on reaction. Next category is the whips. Now, Witch's Locks is the only decent whip. And it's decent only on paired setups. Like, Manhand Whip, Offhand Straight Sword is a nasty setup. And I've also used it with Offhand Halberds, which is also, Poke Halberds, I should say, which is an awesome setup because they combo off of each other decently well. And you can really punish people who want to overly pressure you. But honestly, that is the only whip that does damage. The rest, just go in trash tier. Well, actually, if I'm going to be accurate to the list, go in outclassed tier. Because you can technically still use all the same combos with them, with the same setups, but just do less damage and have less range. So there's no reason to ever use these. The last category we're going to look at is the Rapiers. That is the only bad Rapier, just because it gets outclassed. It's not trash, but it just gets outclassed. It is the longest Rapier, but it also does terrible damage. There's no way of getting good damage out of it. And even on the builds where it does get good damage, a Crystal Stock just does more damage anyways. So there's no real reason to use it. The only thrusting sword that gets solo amenable is Estoc. Now, Estoc has awesome frame data. It's kick, honestly. I haven't used the kick much until now, and it is insane. You can get a ton of priorities off of it. Along with the layering attacks, it's probably the only solo viable thrusting weapon, and it is a very, very good weapon to use. The rest either have their utility under backstab and crit weapons, and or just don't really have much use altogether. Like, the Rapier, Crowquills, and Ricard's Rapier are decent fishing weapons, but that's pretty much it. Like, you may be able to use Crowquills on their own, but they're not the best in the game. And with that about wraps it up. Tell me if you agree with me in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed the video.